HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents What Blest Genius? The Jubilee That Made Shakespeare, 2nd edition, by Andrew Mcconnel Stott. Read by John Lee. Since 1824, the Warwickshire town of Stratford-upon-Avon has held a birthday celebration in honour of William Shakespeare, its most famous son. Music plays, banners are unfurled, and town criers from surrounding communities lead the celebrants in 3 hearty cheers as they parade through quaint and garlanded streets. In 2016, to mark the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, the celebration doubled also as a funerary parade, as, by custom, Shakespeare is said to have been born and died on the same date, April 23rd, which, coincidentally or otherwise, also happens to be St. George's Day, the national day of England. The 2016 celebration acknowledged this duality by beginning in funerary mode as hundreds of respectful devotees, including celebrities, school children, and dignitaries from around the world, paraded mournfully until the halfway point, when the mood was transformed by the arrival of a New Orleans jazz band, who led them joyfully to the poet's graveside at Holy Trinity Church for the laying of wreaths. The night before the parade, Holy Trinity was the site for a performance that it had first hosted 247 years earlier, and never again since, a long poem in praise of Shakespeare, set to musical accompaniment that had originally been delivered by the actor and theatre manager David Garrick. The Dedication Ode, as it was known, was the centrepiece of the world's first literary festival, the Shakespeare Jubilee of 1769, and the subject of this book. Recreating the ode was an especially fitting way to mark a milestone anniversary, as it provided Stratford with an opportunity to acknowledge the historical debt it owed to Garrick, not only for the role he played in making the town a site of tourism and literary pilgrimage, but in cementing forever its civic pride by ensuring Shakespeare's immortal fame. Air 1. Thou soft-flowing Avon, by thy silver stream, of things more than mortal, sweet Shakespeare would dream. The fairies by moonlight dance around his green bed, for hallowed the turf is which pillowed his head. 2. The love-stricken maiden, the soft sighing swain, here rove without danger and sigh without pain. The sweet bud of beauty no blight shall here dread, for hallowed the turf is which pillowed his head. 3. Here youth shall be famed for their love and their truth, and cheerful old age feel the spirit of youth. For the raptures of fancy here poets shall tread, for hallowed the turf is that pillowed his head. 4. Flow on, silver Avon, in song ever flow. Be the swans on thy bosom still whiter than snow. Ever full be thy stream, like his fame may it spread, and the turf ever hallowed, which pillowed his head. Prologue. King George III was not mad about Shakespeare. Was there ever such stuff as the great part of Shakespeare? He complained to the novelist Francis Burney, listing all the characters and plays he objected to. Only it's Shakespeare, and nobody dare abuse him. One should be stoned for saying so. Why would the king, a monarch with dominion spanning 5 continents, need to hide his opinion of a playwright? Yet, at the time of this royal confession in 1785, Shakespeare had attained near godlike status, and harbouring an opposing view ran the risk of seeming lunatic. Such veneration was still relatively new, the result of a period of intense cultural and artistic focus that had transformed Shakespeare from one writer among many to the blessed genius of the Isle. While this transformation occurred over several decades, one event stands out as the moment at which his ascension into national icon and literary deity was finally realized: the Shakespeare Jubilee of 1769. Following Shakespeare's death in 1616, after 2 decades working in London as an actor, manager, shareholder, and playwright of the King's Men, his plays fell quickly from the repertoire. Were it not for the outbreak of the Civil War in 1642, they may never have survived at all. The war brought public entertainments to a halt, and with them a rich theatrical tradition that had been evolving since the Middle Ages. When the theatres reopened with the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, the new king, Charles II, gave the job of reviving the theatre to two of his loyal courtiers, Thomas Killigrew and Sir William Davenant, presenting each man with a royal patent to open a playhouse. With no new plays and few experienced actors, the task was a challenging one. Killigrew had the advantage, as, thanks to a close friendship with the king, he was allowed to style his troupe the King's Company, and thus claim a direct lineage from Shakespeare's King's Men, along with the rights to perform its theatrical properties. While this included Shakespeare's work, the real prize was the enormously popular comedies of Shakespeare's contemporary Ben Jonson, as well as the tragicomedies of Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher, Jacobean writing partners, still held in high esteem. By contrast, Davenant, a pug-faced poet with a wig as thick as a privet hedge, was granted the rights to only 2 plays from the old repertoire. After much grousing, he petitioned the Lord Chamberlain with a proposition of reforming some of the most ancient plays, presenting him with a list that included Tempest, Measures for Measures, Much Ado About Nothing, Rome and Juliet, Twelfth Night, The Life of King Henry VIII, King Lear, The Tragedy of Macbeth, and The Tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. Davenant got what he asked for, but only on condition that he make the plays fit, that is, adapt them for a culture that had essentially moved on. As Shakespeare's plays had first debuted when Davenant's audience's grandparents were children, it was clear that he would need to revise heavily. And this is what he did, changing endings and updating themes to suit the newness of the age, adding music and spectacle to exploit the technologies available in the new theatres, and introducing new characters and subplots, especially ones that emphasized another innovation, female actors in female roles. Davenant even conflated 2 plays to make one, all the while making sure to plane the knots and tubercles from Shakespeare's original language that sounded archaic and tortuous to the Restoration ear. The result was a resounding success, as epitomized by his 1664 production of Macbeth, which featured flying witches, songs, dances, and a happy ending, accompanied by a semi-operatic score. This Macbeth was not a Shakespeare play so much as a Shakespeare-inspired entertainment, one that had the contradictory effect of elevating Shakespeare within the culture, even as its popularity was based on how far it had moved away. The thought would not have crossed Davenant's mind that Shakespeare's text was sacrosanct, an inviolate canon that couldn't be touched. It was, instead, a wellspring of concepts, characters, and situations to be plundered at will. This was the paradox that fueled Shakespeare's initial ascent to cultural icon. The more that theatre audiences came to know him through versions that had been altered, adapted, and heavily revised, the more his capital grew. By the advent of the 18th century, this was buoyed by the appearance of many cheap editions of his works, permitting a more private and contemplative relationship with the plays to emerge. More often than not, these came prefaced with a biographical sketch written by the poet Nicholas Rowe for his 1709 edition of the works, and reprinted in almost every edition of Shakespeare for the next 100 years. As is often noted, the verifiable facts of Shakespeare's life can be written on a postcard, while still leaving room for a greeting. He was baptized, he married, he owned some property and wrote some plays. Into this void Rowe threw unverified fragments and second-hand anecdotes to portray an Englishman of wit, sincerity, compassion, and good fellowship, Sweet Willie, the bard of Avon, a raw talent tutored by nature and unhindered by the artificial prescripts of formal literary culture. This was the hero championed by groups like the Shakespeare Ladies' Club, formed in the 1730s to oppose the influence of French and Italian dramatic models on the British stage, promoting instead an English drama that they felt represented decency and good manners. By the 1740s, Shakespeare's status was such that a marble statue was erected to him in Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner. Despite being praised by the London Evening Post for its presentation of the poet in the dress of his time, natural, free, and easy, it was a highly Georgian vision of the past, not so much a likeness as the apparition of genius within English literature's holiest spot. Even as Shakespeare's reputation grew, there was some way left to go before he would reach his current status as the world's most famous writer. For that, we can thank the actor, dramatist, and theatre manager David Garrick, who, from his debut in 1741 to his retirement from the stage in 1776, was the most famous man in Britain after the King, not to mention a cultural broker so influential that the poet William Whitehead wrote of him that a nation's taste depends on you, perhaps a nation's virtue too. Garrick built his career around the performance and promotion of Shakespeare, becoming so closely associated with him that the biographer James Granger has written that it is hard to say whether Shakespeare owes more to Garrick or Garrick to Shakespeare. Having taken over the management of Drury Lane in 1747, which, along with Covent Garden, was one of the most important theatres in the kingdom, Garrick immediately declared it the house of William Shakespeare, and embarked on a project intended to bring artistic and intellectual gravity to the stage. But Garrick was no purist either, cutting, adapting, and remodelling the works of his idol as he thought fit. Sometimes, like Davenant before him, he made entirely new entertainments from more unpopular plays. His Catherine and Petruchio, for example, was a successful and much-loved version of The Taming of the Shrew, which in its unaltered form was considered wholly unwatchable by 18th-century audiences. Even when largely following a text, he was unafraid to make structural alterations. In 1756, he debuted a version of King Lear, built on the foundations of an earlier adaptation that gave the play a happy ending, by making Cordelia queen and allowing Lear to pass away his life in quietness and devotion, a version that was still standard when Queen Victoria came to the throne. For the critics of the day, this was a marked improvement. Garrick, claimed to the London Magazine, had assisted the deficiencies of Shakespeare. The Shakespeare Jubilee of 1769 was the conclusive moment of Garrick's relationship with Shakespeare, a literal coronation of his muse, witnessed and legitimized by some of the most influential tastemakers in the nation. Garrick's friend, James Boswell, the writer, lawyer, diarist, and future biographer of Samuel Johnson, was one of them, describing it as an elegant and truly classical celebration of the memory of Shakespeare. He and his fellow attendees, numbering in the thousands, enjoyed 3 days of songs, balls, and pageants set in the hallowed turf of Shakespeare's hometown of Stratford-upon-Avon, culminating in Garrick's bravura reading of the Dedication Ode, a long, rambling poem scored by the Drury Lane Orchestra and delivered before a statue of the bard Garrick had gifted the town. But while the Jubilee was a formal instantiation of Shakespeare as the creative genius par excellence, capping a century of his movement toward the centre of the literary pantheon, it was a peculiar foundation on which to build an enduring hagiography. The Jubilee was a hodgepodge, a gallimaufry of inconsistencies and contradictory motivations that featured little of the work of its honoree. Not a single scene from Shakespeare was performed, let alone an entire play. Shakespeare was more like the Jubilee's sponsor, presiding over a series of events and entertainments that by themselves had very little to do with him, the body of his work featuring only as echoes and fragments, or as song lyrics and quotations, and allegorized images painted on the backlit transparencies that illuminated the windows of the town hall. While Boswell revelled in the event, others found the Jubilee bizarre. The writer Horace Walpole blushed to hear of Garrick's nonsense, while Samuel Johnson boycotted it entirely. For the actor-manager Samuel Foote, a constant thorn in Garrick's side, the Jubilee was nothing more than avarice and vanity. Such was Garrick's desire to fleece the people and transmit his name down to posterity hand in hand with Shakespeare. Personal and commercial ambitions were certainly never far from the surface. This included the mayor and aldermen of Stratford-upon-Avon, who hoped that the influx of visitors would boost their flagging economy, as well as Garrick, whose own sense of finitude, as he neared the end of his acting career and managed his failing health, played a big part in his plans. There were political considerations, too. By choosing to celebrate Shakespeare in the town of his birth, with its timber-framed houses, reedy riverbanks, and airy open fields, Garrick sought to deploy Shakespeare as a soothing and bucolic parent to the nation, at a time when Britain was in turmoil, with riots and hunger commonplace, and political institutions shaken by a strong populist movement led by a pugnacious and resilient leader named John Wilkes. Add to this a ruckus in the papers, a giant sea turtle, crooked waiters, the suspicions of the locals, dubious relics, extortionate prices, chaotic organization, a floating rotunda, death from exposure, and unceasing floods of rain, and the Jubilee of 1769 comes to seem like an abject folly. Yet a multitude attended, albeit for a variety of reasons, some coming out of reverence for Shakespeare's artistic achievement, others to be seen at what quickly became the most talked-about society event of the year. Boswell, always such a candid and agreeable recorder of life, came to do both. His story adds useful context to the Jubilee, since in many ways he was the perfect audience for Garrick's spectacle, making the most of everything it had to offer. Boswell experienced the Jubilee in the fullness of its contradictions, not as a singular or prescriptive event, but as a space of loose and improvised connections, providing the opportunity to braid together separate strands of the worlds he occupied, including his love of theatre, his talent for shameless self-promotion, and a chance to engage in the pleasures of friendship, hedonism, and the erotic possibilities of other people's bodies. An outspoken advocate for Garrick's project, Boswell believed devoutly in the civilizing power of communal artistic experiences and in the actor's responsibility to serve as an agent of intellectual ennoblement via his or her role as the intermediary between audiences and great art. Whether being playful or sombre, he made the Jubilee entirely his own, like a Frenchman at an ordinary, he said, who takes out of his pocket a box of pepper and other spices and seasons a dish his own way. In many respects, the ability to season the dish and adapt Shakespeare to suit one's own palate is the lasting contribution of the Jubilee. For all its paradox and absurdities, Garrick's revel on the banks of the Avon established the terms under which Shakespeare has infused our culture through the succeeding centuries, as an enduring ghost, ever present yet insubstantial, the weightiest of cultural authorities, understood as much by his name and the associations he invokes as by sustained engagement with his works. As such, the Jubilee is a defining moment in our cultural history, and one that goes to show how, through a confluence of intent, mishap, and grubby self-interest, the most glorious and enduring of myths was made. 1. On May 3rd, 1769, George Keat and Francis Wheeler emerged from the vegetal shade of Covent Garden Market and strode the 20 paces down to David Garrick's house at 27 Southampton Street. Stiff with reverence for the object they bore before them, they made an unlikely pair. Keat, a camel-faced minor poet, who in the course of many years abroad had become close friends with Voltaire, the genius of French literature, now enjoyed a leisurely life, thanks to a substantial portfolio of Whitechapel properties that afforded him the time to write delicate volumes of verse that he doted on like children. Wheeler, by contrast, worked for a living, serving as the steward of the Court of Records for the borough of Stratford in Warwickshire, the reward for which was a modest £10 a year. Garrick greeted his guests with characteristic good grace, despite having only recently risen from what he described as the bed of death, fighting off a combined assault of fever, gout, jaundice, and stones. Illness lowered him often, the result of being born with only a single kidney, and even more so now that he had entered his 50s. It was following a bout of sickness that he had first made Keats' acquaintance while convalescing in Bath. Garrick's skin was yellow then, and shaking and puking between curative dips, he had found that Keats' drowsy, convivial manner and unusual face, he had no eyelashes or eyebrows, lifted his spirits. The two men had been on good terms ever since, which is why Wheeler had asked Keats to come along. Being in the London home of the world's most famous actor was an unsettling experience for this provincial man, and he mirrored his host's cautious, recuperative movements in his own uncertain bearing. On the walls hung views of Garrick's Hampton villa, with its classically inspired Temple to Shakespeare, where Garrick, his wife, the Austrian dancer Eva Maria Weigel, La Violette, and their spaniel, Biddy, presided over a span of the Thames, fat and prosperous and fringed with lithe willows. Introductions over, Wheeler presented Garrick with a cassolet, an ornately carved box, fashioned from wood the colour of oxblood. On one side, the box showed the naked figure of Fame, offering up a bust of William Shakespeare to be crowned with laurels by the three Graces, while behind them rose the sharp spire of Stratford-upon-Avon's Holy Trinity Church. The other side showed Garrick performing King Lear, mad and unbattened on the moor. Garrick turned it in his hands like a magical object. With its fine carving and silver feet in the form of dragons, it was a thing of beauty, with a divine provenance he understood immediately, carved as it was from a mulberry tree planted by William Shakespeare himself. The box contained more than the Warwickshire air, for inside was a sealed proclamation resolving that out of love and regard to the memory of that incomparable poet, Mr. William Shakespeare, and in honour of the extraordinary accomplishments and merits of his most judicious admirer and representative, David Garrick, Esquire, Garrick had been unanimously elected an honorary burgess of Stratford-upon-Avon by the corporation, as the small town council was known. He had been given notice that the honour was coming, but was delighted all the same. The freedom of your town given to me unanimously, sent to me in such an elegant and inestimable box, he wrote to the mayor and aldermen, and delivered to me in so flattering a manner, merit my warmest gratitude. It will be impossible for me ever to forget those who have honoured me so much as to mention my unworthy name with that of their immortal townsman. Others sought darker motives. I have long made it my observation, wrote a correspondent to the London newspaper, Public Advertiser, that no gifts are in general so pernicious as those composed of wood. The most ancient of these gifts on record was, I believe, that of the gods to Pandora, and next in order of time the Trojan horse. The box certainly came with intent, for at the same moment that Garrick was accepting the freedom of the town, the mayor and his aldermen were preparing paragraphs to send to the London papers that claimed that Garrick was considering holding an event in their town, a festival he would call Shakespeare's Jubilee. The press did the rest. We hear the entertainments in general at the Jubilee will be the most elegant and magnificent ever exhibited in the country, wrote the Public Advertiser, adding that the celebration was to be kept up every 7th year. Placed on the back foot, and keen to get ahead of the news, Garrick decided to announce the plans himself from the stage at Drury Lane, following his final performance of the season, a benefit for the Fund for Decayed Actors. My eyes, till then, no sights like these will see, he told the audience on May 18th, 1769, unless we meet at Shakespeare's Jubilee, on Avon's banks, where flowers eternal blow, like its full stream our gratitude shall flow. Then let us revel, show our fond regard, on that loved spot first breathed our matchless bard. To him all honour, gratitude is due, to him we owe our all, to him and you. Jubilee was a curious word to describe a gathering in honour of a playwright. With its origins in Jewish antiquity, the word had become closely associated with the Catholic Church, following its adoption in the 14th century by Pope Boniface VIII to describe a year of solemnity and pilgrimages, in which the faithful might earn a plenary indulgence and be granted remission from temporal sin. Garrick chose it to connote the extent of his devotion, as well as time apart from the usual run of life, but whether he truly meant to invoke the full extent of its religiosity was unclear. As a pilgrimage, no one knew exactly what it would entail, least of all David Garrick. The last time Garrick had seen the mulberry tree, he had been standing in its patulous shade in the garden of New Place, Stratford-upon-Avon's second-largest house, and the home William Shakespeare had purchased in May 1597, with the money he had made as a successful poet and playwright. When Garrick visited one fine afternoon in 1742, the tree was thriving, as was Garrick, who was fast on his way to becoming the most famous man in Britain. The third of 7 children, David Garrick had been born at the Angel Inn, Hereford, in 1717, before moving to the Midlands town of Lichfield, where his maternal grandfather was Vicar Choral. The family was of French descent, Huguenot Protestants from east of Bordeaux, who had fled to Britain in 1685 following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, anglicising their surname from Garrick. Garrick's father had become an army officer, albeit one who spent much of his career on half-pay. Despite financial constraints, the Garricks approximated a genteel life, which meant that at the age of 10, David was sent to Dr. John Hunter's grammar school to receive a formal education. While too prankish and distracted to focus on his studies, it was here that he received his first opportunity to perform in a play, corralling his classmates at the age of 11 into a production of George Farquhar's The Recruiting Officer. Soon after, the want of money forced Garrick's father to take a commission in Gibraltar. David was also sent away, travelling to Lisbon, where he apprenticed for an uncle who worked in the wine trade. This uncle, a sombre bachelor who struggled to endure a lively 12-year-old with a talent for mimicry, sent him home again. David returned to England to find that, with his father away, his older brother Peter, serving in the Navy, and his mother and elder sister frequently ill, he had been promoted to the household's titular head. The first signs of a talent for management emerged as David took on this responsibility, writing long letters to his father full of financial news and family matters that revelled in their own importance. As he grew and became better known around the Cathedral Close and its small but accomplished social circle, his open countenance, winning manner, and confidence in his own abilities began to show themselves as assets capable of overcoming his indifferent scholarship and modest family. Aged 18, he left Dr. Hunter's school and went to study at the establishment of a young schoolmaster named Samuel Johnson, who had founded an academy 3 miles outside town. Johnson, an intense and lurching man of formidable erudition, was at odds with conventional schooling and wished to practice his own theories of education. Despite springing for an advertisement in the Gentleman's Magazine, Johnson's school attracted only 3 students, 2 of whom were David Garrick and Garrick's younger brother, George. The experiment was doomed from the start. Johnson was too volatile to be a teacher and could not mask his perpetual annoyance or forbear from swearing. His pupils afforded him little respect and would stand at his bedroom door giggling as he made passionate protestations of love to his wife, Tetty, 20 years his senior and, according to Garrick, very fat, with a bosom of more than ordinary protuberance, with swelled cheeks of a florid red, produced by thick painting and increased by the liberal use of cordials, flaring and fantastic in her dress, and affected both in her speech and her general behaviour. Johnson closed his school within a year, but retained a close relationship with his former pupil. In March 1737, having both outgrown Lichfield, they paired up to depart for new lives in London. Garrick's father intended him to study for the law, whereas Johnson dreamed of becoming a playwright, and carried with him a half-finished tragedy called Irene that he hoped to see on stage. To save money, they shared a horse, with one man riding ahead and tethering it up the road where the other would find it, and ride himself for a while. Garrick, compact, energetic, and fevering to meet the world, had just turned 20. Johnson, 27, loomed over him, a monstrous house of bones, hideously striking to the eye, as his friend and biographer James Boswell would remember him, with the scars of his scrofula deeply visible. London in 17...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?